Canadian cinema from the 80s, even stuff financed by the Crown Corporation Telefilm Canada, can be a total disaster. Another aspect are the tax shelter films. Basically, any sort of investment into Canadian films can be completely written off. It was a ridiculous tax loophole. It resulted in a lot of shot on video horror films that can border on being avant garde, with films like Wicked World, Things, or Science Crazed. Emeritus Films was another example that is full of shot on video stuff, including more horrors such as The Tower and perhaps The Bounty Hunters, but also in films such as 1812, which was completely baffling. This leads to more uncharted territory. The 80s were the prime time for romantic media. There are, of course, the essential rom-coms of the time, both for teens and adults, and that meant ones direct to TV, or even more strange, even available in places like department stores. I found out about one called the Shades of Love series, which is a collection of 16 films that were made for TV and sold through Lorimar Home Video. This fits into many of the tropes of the genre at the time, and that's even with this release that I'm exploring. I will be exploring the film Sincerely Violet, which was completely deranged. I knew I was going to have to talk about it right after seeing it and its incredibly strange plot, but then I realized how in-depth this rabbit hole is. It does fit into the sort of political cycle we have when you connect 80s era Reaganomics with Trump's current policies, but also how subversive this film is, accidental or not. It does obviously mean that this will be quite a political episode and frankly cynical, but perhaps with connecting stuff with the past we will know how to better the future. But first, let's do the fun stuff. To explore how deranged this film is, we first must remember what the tropes are, especially of the era. I will link it in the description, but there's a Screen Rant article and we can quickly list them. A love-hate relationship, a makeover montage, a serenade scene, women against each other, a grand romantic confession, being ugly without glasses, hot without them, opposites attract, the stereotype that woman needs love and man hates commitment, seeing it through the more woman's point of view, and finally, little to no minority characters. This film has 7 of them, possibly 8 out of 10 if a guy's saying you Americans have strange customs when they're both doing snow angels counts as opposites attract. Oddly enough, it skipped a trope that I believe is huge for the era as well, and it was heavily utilized here. The comedy of errors. A misunderstanding happens and it only gets worse from there, especially when it gets in the way of the other trope, the grand romantic confession. With this entry and the rest of the series, they basically wanted to make a sort of visual novel to help with the romantic aspect. They wanted a nobody to play the woman lead and have a more famous actor playing the man. This is because they thought having a nobody means that it's easier for the woman to relate to the character, like a sort of self-insert sort of thing. In this case, the lead is played by Patricia Phillips, who does not even have a photo on IMDb. She still acts today, but seems to have mostly played smaller roles. As for the hunk, he's played by Simon McCorkindale. He's in some pretty awesome stuff like Relic Hunter, Jaws 3D, and The Sword and the Sorcerer, and the show I really need to see that is called Manimal, which is, yes, a man that can anamorph himself into any animal to stop crime. So, we'll explore some of its deranged plot with the tropes to show how it somehow fits the mold, yet breaks it at the same time. It stars a strong, independent, and fierce history professor named Elizabeth. She is at the point where those aspects scare the guy who is about to walk up to her to ask her out. This is an 80s rom-com trope, but this becomes a very important point for when I reach the historical and political section of this episode. She needs access to a document owned by a very rich man named Mark. He refuses to give up the document for her and announces that he will be out of town for a while anyways. That sets the first trope between the two, the love-hate relationship. When she's getting drunk with her psychiatrist friend, let's just say something stupid comes up. Say, we're both drunk now, and Elizabeth needs that document. Mark is out of town. What if Elizabeth breaks into his house, steals the document, and returns it before he comes back? For some reason, they choose to do so, which although deranged, makes for a fun film idea, despite the wild choice of her having to do this without her glasses. This plan fails right from the get-go, as the second she enters his bedroom, she sees that he's still there, obviously meaning that he just said that to dismiss her during the phone call. During her search, he wakes up and holds a gun at her. The psychiatrist then comes to the rescue. How would she do it, you might add? She says something like, "Oh, thank you for rescuing my patient. Her name is Violet. She is a paranoid schizophrenic with kleptomaniac tendencies." He then asks if he can help in any way, but they reject that. He then calls afterwards, saying that he would like to meet Violet again. So, the comedy of errors truly begins. This leads to two tropes at once. They do a makeover montage and have to remove her glasses, although to be fair, in this case it's more logical than usual. They did this knowing that she won't be able to see, so I will still accept the ugly with glasses trope, on top of the makeover one. The thing that plays around with this is that they must make her dress like a schizophrenic. So, what would that outfit be? Of course, a ridiculous one. She has a bob, totally unmatching accessories and colors, and probably the worst faux pas out there, socks with heels. Symbolically, perhaps the chaotic outfit is meant to represent the chaotic mind of a schizophrenic? I'm probably looking too deep into this, but then again, his hair is like the 80s version of Bieber hair, so maybe they were just made for each other. Then, there's her personality. She has an accent that I have no idea how to describe it, like a Texan trying to be sensual. It of course sounds awful, but that with a camp personality does show that she's trying to have fun, which leads to another important point for later on. During this, and him knowing that she's lying to a small extent, they eventually fall in love. It is a great moment because it's a dinner date, and everyone does energetic dancing while she gazes at him in a vision where he is wearing a top hat, among others. During this comes the next trope of the serenade scene, which is also strange because they're dancing to a slow love song while everyone else is still going about their energetic dance. She realizes that this can't go on, so she writes a letter dumping him. However, he changed his ways and goes to Elizabeth to give the document. He somehow doesn't at all recognize that it's the same person, which I'm not saying this in a mean way, but her face is quite distinctive in a way that her two different hairstyles don't hide it. So he must not be the smartest person. This means he falls in love with her a second time, but it somehow gets weird. He talks about the woman, Violet, and she gets jealous of her. Yes, she gets jealous of herself. I know this sounds like a weird plot hole, but this leads into another point. Because of this, it leads to the end of the comedy of errors trope, which has her dressing as Violet. Of course, he is outraged, and the relationship is over. She's depressed, working constantly, and finally in a voicemail hears the grand dramatic gesture. At least kind of, it was honestly lazy. And really, that's all you need to know about the plot. So, simply seeing the whole paranoid alter ego thing, alongside some baffling editing choices, already makes this stand out as one incredibly strange rom-com, and it stands out even more against the onslaught of romance that was prevalent in the 80s. However, first we must explore what made romance so prevalent in the 80s, and how does that fit in with today? The answer is neoliberalism. Yeah, I know, this comes across as a little weird considering Trump and his social issues. However, with the neoliberal aspects such as letting the free market do whatever they want, it is quite similar to Reagan back in the 80s, and well, Reagan was nearly as bad as Trump in the social aspect too anyways. If any proof is needed, when Trump first won in 2016, he did say that he pretty much wanted to be the next Reagan. Because of their pressure for neoliberalism, both decades reached the point of hypercapitalism. The difference is that with Trump, we're starting to enter the collapse of it, so the way he is utilizing everything comes across as like a last-ditch attempt. Both decades had this sort of quote-unquote woke form of corporations, stuff that is good in one sense as they help minorities, yet also perpetuates a culture war in a way that is planned out to keep the ones high up in power. With that, there's not really a sense of liberation, and if you look at the lower class, it still shows a sort of disregard for minorities. A perfect setup is made as well because both politicians can spawn a sort of culture war for this. Simply make any scapegoats you can and promise a return to suburban America by fighting against the corporations. With this culture war, It brings in a sense of toxic competition as well, and media shows how wrong that is. Many of these romances have a right-wing agenda to them. Even the Shades of Love series has a few entries that are purely the rags to riches story, simply letting the man of the relationship be the breadwinner, or the newfound Hallmark films being the Christmas films that have ballerina farm style endings, where the woman must quit her fancy job and be the stay at home wife. Horror films are able to fight this as well. The 1980s are especially apparent because we can view it through a more historical lens. Many of them show the true nightmares of suburban America, such as the film The Stepfather, where it shows him killing a family that wants to go outside of that stereotype, or the films that deal with minorities that weren't treated well despite the woke minorities, by mostly using queer subtext. The other case people don't investigate are the statistics of dating. Unfortunately, it's hard to get a consistent source on this, especially as we're still in the middle of the decade, but over a third of adults were single in the 80s, and that number is around the same now. This leads to another point. What media is huge in both decades? Romance. There's a return of romantic novels this decade. I won't say where I live, but there's even a store dedicated purely to romance novels, which says enough. This is what led to films such as this in the 80s as well. Of course, that doesn't connect it specifically to this film, but with that sort of woke corporate aspect, there was that introduction to women in the workforce. Because it was a highly competitive environment, especially with men refusing to give up those positions, it led to women having to put up that same white collar mask. They had to be fierce and independent, even if it's against their personalities. The film Devil Wears Prada shows this extremely well, albeit in a misanthropic way that is almost too intense for me. This film takes an almost more positive approach at least. It all comes down to how Violet is. It allowed Elizabeth to play someone as weird as they want to be. In a sense, Violet was her sense of freedom. She didn't have to put on that workplace facade anymore that she was using to an extent with Mark. But when she must leave that alter ego, that fun side of her is gone. Will she always have to stick with that facade while being with him in the future? Or will she perhaps finally let loose and let a little bit of Violet enter her life? Fortunately, it does show hints of that with the Snow Angel scene. She realized what Mark actually loved about her and knew that it wasn't the facade nor the need of alcohol to let loose. She just needed to be herself. However, the more depressing factor is when you look at the right-wing based media at the time, when to an extent this is still a rags to riches story. Is she going to leave her job and become the stay-at-home wife now that she's dating a very rich man? Or will it be like the Reagan-era hypercapitalism, where they'll have someone like a migrant working for them to raise the kids? Even with low-budget deranged media, a lot of them can be responses to socio-political movements at the time. Even the Shades of Love series itself shows this well, because the films came out almost monthly. Even the romance films turned into an assembly line. Thanks for listening to this episode, and I'll see you next Monday.